him.
Just like I am no longer.
I have him as the last of the introductions, anyway. So. All right. So we'll do a soft start here because one of our panel members is taking a quick break. But hi all. Welcome to our afternoon question and answer panel, or however you want to think about this. I'm super excited to be sort of introducing these people. Three excellent senior researchers in this area: Bill Klein, David Sherman, and Geoff Cohen. And the structure of this session is meant to get some discussion going and kind of have a little bit of crosstalk. So we'll start with each panel member giving a pretty brief introduction into some work that they've been doing, things they've been thinking about, kind of leave it open and up to them. And then I have a few themes that I'll offer our panelists to kind of discuss a little bit for you guys. And finally, then we'll open it up to questions if anyone has any questions or other things they'd like to kind of discuss with everyone. And I'm going to try and keep an eye on the time here, and I might try and wrap things up or move us on a little bit, but hopefully I'll stay in the background as much as possible here. So we'll go ahead and get started here with Bill Klein, who's the Associate Director of the Behavioral Research Program at the National Cancer Institute, and an absolutely lovely collaborator who will drop anything to read a draft that you have or discuss a new study idea, which is wonderful. And it's a bit of a homecoming for Bill, as he was a professor here at Pitt before his role at NCI.
Thanks. Yeah, I have to say, first of all, thank you to Janine, to Cody, to Kevin, and all those who put this meeting together. It's just a thrill to be here. And it's particularly fun for me to be here because this is where I started doing self-affirmation research. As some of you know, I was a faculty member at Pitt for some time and started doing self-affirmation research here, and it was me and my students. And now I come back here, and there's this whole self-affirmation community here in Pittsburgh. It's really fun. A lot of that work was done with Peter Harris. Peter spent a sabbatical with me here in Pittsburgh. Came from the UK and became a big Pittsburgh Steelers fan in the process. So that was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed working with him. So I want to make 3 points to get us started. The first point is we've been talking about this thing called self-affirmation all day, and many of us have been doing self-affirmation research for years. And I would like to argue that we still don't really know what it is that we're doing. So people often ask me, tell me about your work on self-affirmation. And so I get confident, I get into my Amy Cuddy power pose, I'm all excited to talk about it. And words start coming out of my mouth that sound like the words we've been hearing all day today: moral adequacy, integrity, values. And by the end of it, my shoulders start slumping, I'm not in the power pose anymore, and I realize I don't really know what I'm talking about. These are big words: values, moral adequacy, integrity. I spent a lot of time around people in public health and medicine and in nursing at the National Cancer Institute, where I work now, and they talk about things like blood pressure. It's something you can measure and something you can address very easily, right? And self-affirmation is not blood pressure. It's this sort of cloudy, very cool thing that maybe is a little hard to define. And I think Claude did a wonderful job for us in getting us started thinking about it. But what I find is that when you really get down to brass tacks to define what a self-affirmation is and how to manipulate it in an experiment or how to operationalize it in an intervention, it gets a little more dodgy. So Jen Tabor talked about some data that we've been working on where we tried to use self-affirmation in a mobile app context to help smokers quit smoking. And Jen will tell you there were times we sat around trying to make decisions about how we were going to do this. We made up self-affirmations, on the fly because we didn't really have a literature to work from. There are self-affirmation interventions out there, but there really isn't a menu of self-affirmations you can incorporate into that kind of setting. And then I remember we talked about how many? 7, 9, 1 a day, 2 a day. These are the kinds of questions that are often talked about in medicine. You should take your Advil, twice a day, based on BMI or based on weight, right? We have very clear rules for how that's done. We have really no rules for how to operationalize a self-affirmation. And it seems like that's something that we all share a responsibility to do rather than sort of making it up on the spot. I have to tell you that Becky Ferrer, one of my colleagues, and I have tried to do this a little bit. We tried to deconstruct the self-affirmation intervention, just piecing it apart to see what we could get. So for example, we had one condition where we simply asked people to circle all the letter I's in a paragraph. Now for those of you who remember from graduate school, all the work on priming, that's supposed to be a way to prime the self, right? And I have to tell you, and you're not going to want to know this, that manipulation was almost as effective as the classy, write about your values affirmation in reducing defensiveness, which suggests that activating the self, oh my goodness, might just be enough, right? That's just one study. We need to replicate it. That was one condition. We also had a condition where we thought, what if it's just activating people's values? It's not about making people reflect on how their values, how they act in a way consistent with their values, but it's just bringing their values online. So we had people write an essay about a value that was important to them and a time when they acted in a way inconsistent with that value, right? Does that sound like cognitive dissonance to you, which is really what self-affirmation theory was all about, right? And we found actually that had a positive impact as well. So simply just having people think about their value might be enough. It may not be that they have to write about times they've been consistent. Now this is just a teaser because these are preliminary data and we're going to try to replicate and do a couple different things with them. But I think what they suggest is that we really do need to deconstruct this thing that we call self-affirmation and understand what it really is. And that brings me to my second point, which is that once we know what it is and we know what to do with it, we need to take it to scale. We heard that term earlier today, and that's a term I hear a lot at NIH, taking things to scale. I spend a lot of time around people in public health, and they talk about the big public health successes of the last century. And what do you think they talk about? Excise taxes on cigarettes, massive effect on smoking. Smoke-free policies, massive effect on tobacco use. And one of my favorites, fluoride in the water. Putting fluoride in the water, massive effect on tooth decay. What I want to know is, can we put self-affirmation in the water, right? I was imagining we could make a couple million copies of Steel 1988 and throw them into the water table. I don't think Claude would appreciate that. I don't think the environment would appreciate that, and it wouldn't work. But seriously, is there some way to incorporate self-affirmation into the woodwork? I think the folks doing education work are already ahead of us on that because they're incorporating that into schools. So David and Geoff and others who have been doing all this great education work, you're getting these kids early on, and maybe because of the recursive processes that you've talked about in your work, you're getting them to do this continually throughout their lifetimes, and that's wonderful. How can we do this more at a population level scale? Can we really put it in the water so that we don't have to do interventions anymore, and it's just part of the way we think? And maybe you think that's a difficult thing to do, but think about some of the population level interventions that we've done over the last 100 years or so that are a little more social and psychological in nature. There are some out there, and they're not all great, by the way. The self-esteem movement of the 1980s, where we made all kids feel happy and good and have high self-esteem. Yeah, US kids' self-esteem went up and their academic performance went down. So we do have to be careful about trying something like that, but I would argue that it is possible and we should be thinking about it. So that's point number 2. And point number 3 is, well, wait a second, before we start throwing all of this stuff in the water, let's make sure that we know what we're doing and we're not doing harm, right? We want to make sure that we are helping people. And we know actually from a couple studies that were discussed today and some other studies in literature that sometimes self-affirmation in fact does harm, that you can get people at the wrong time and make them more defensive and have them do worse things after self-affirming. And if that's the case, we should know what those boundary conditions are. By a show of hands, how many people here have tried to do a self-affirmation study and it bombed and it didn't work? Okay. I was hoping some people would raise their hands because if I'm the only one, I just would fold my tent and walk out. Yeah, Peter. And Peter, you and I have definitely had a couple of major bombs, yeah. Now, that's not surprising, right? We do research, and Elliot Aronson is one of my favorite social psychologists and also a huge baseball fan. He would say that in baseball, if you bat 300 in your career, which means you get about 30% of your at-bats as hits, you make the Hall of Fame. That's great. And he used to say, well, that's what I feel like as a social psychologist. If 30% of my studies work, I'm going to make the Hall of Fame. And boy, did he make the Hall of Fame, right? So it's not surprising that a lot of our studies don't work. But we also need to understand why they don't work and why it is that sometimes this thing, self-affirmation, really is effective and other times it's not. And I don't think we have enough of a handle on that. I can make all kinds of post hoc explanations for why some of my studies work and some don't. And you might even believe some of them, and I might even believe some of them. But the bottom line is we don't really know. Sometimes it has to do with nuances of the setting, of the population, of other factors that we really just haven't defined or even thought about. And I think our literature could expand greatly if we could get more of a menu of factors, a better sense of what those boundary factors are. And if we can do that, then we can take this to scale and help interventionists do a better job of taking what we've learned in this literature and using it out there in the real world. So those are my 3 points. I'll pass it to you guys.
All right, thanks, Bill. So now I'm going to introduce David Sherman, who's a professor in the Psychological and Brain Sciences Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an incredibly thoughtful mentor and scientist who is constantly enthusiastic about science. So I'd love for him to share his enthusiasm here.
All right. Well, thanks. It's been an exciting and stimulating day to hear all this work in progress. So it's just a lot of fun to be in the position and hear all this exciting work and different ways that people are pushing the theory and the research. So I guess keeping with the three, I'll have three kind of general points and then one thing that I'm excited about in my own affirmation research. The first is about how we communicate about our studies and think about the issues that we are trying to ameliorate when we are engaged in doing a study where we think that an affirmation is, or any type of social psychological intervention is going to reduce some sort of threat response and lead to some sort of hopefully positive outcome. And I just want to be cautious and when we think about a relatively simple manipulation, does that mean, is an implication of that the problem has a simple cause? And it doesn't. And we all realize this. But there's a tendency to reduce the problems or the issues that are being addressed by self-affirmation or by any social psychological intervention to minimize that and to focalize those within the individual. You know, and maybe some of my responses to some of the talks today sort of highlight that. So whether it's achievement gaps, okay? When we think about achievement gaps, we need to recognize and write about and emphasize the different economic, sociocultural, historical factors that lead to achievement gaps. And within that context, think about the student or the person in the situation and how they're construing that. But we really need in our papers and in our writing and our talking with the media to emphasize that structural context. If we put too much emphasis, or if people who put too much emphasis on the intervention itself, it runs the risk of saying that these problems are located within the self of the person within that situation. And we see that sometimes in how the work is represented in the media. And so I think as we move forward with our research, as we think about our problems, stepping back and spending a lot of time looking at the work of other fields, of sociologists, of political scientists, of historians, and understanding all the different factors that lead to whatever issue it is that we want to address is really important for us to understand the context with which we're doing studies and to communicate that as well, in particular when we're speaking to broader audiences. So that's kind of the first thing I've been sort of thinking about. The second has to do with thinking about whether the outcomes in studies that we look at are kind of consensually positive among the different participants in the research process. Okay? And to not assume that our interests are necessarily the consensually beneficial outcomes for everyone in the research process. So let me just take an example. I had some colleagues who study relationship satisfaction, okay? And they look at that as an outcome, okay? And relationship maintenance as an outcome among college students, college student couples. So let's say you do a study that shows that self-affirmation or any social psychological intervention leads to greater relationship maintenance. Okay? Well, I think we need to say, is that necessarily a beneficial outcome from the standpoint of, if you look at a lot of college relationships are bad relationships. They're short-term relationships. They may not be the best relationships. The point is that I think we need to think about the outcomes that we're looking at from the perspective of the person. It might be better from that person's perspective to exit the relationship. Okay? We can't automatically assume that, though we have to think about it from different perspectives and not automatically assume that the outcome that we may think for theoretical reasons is beneficial is in fact beneficial from the perspective of the person. So just to be kind of cautious in that. When I think about persistence in academic outcomes, I think about that. I think about just hearing the studies that I heard about today. I think about some of the PhD students who left our program are doing great, right? They're having very successful outcomes, very successful lives. So we should consider and measure and incorporate into our studies what the outcomes are more generally, so that we could be able to assess that from the person's perspective, what is the beneficial outcome. Okay. Just a third thing that I'd like to just kind of comment on generally is the collaborative spirit of affirmation research, which I think is really one of the reasons that I've enjoyed doing it for so many years, is hearing about the different work that other people are doing and understanding how people take their own, how Jenny put the photo of the elephant. I think I like that perspective because over the years, people have taken different theoretical perspectives and shed light on it in different ways. So that Cheryl Waxlack and Yakov Trope, for example, experts in construal level theory, they say, well, what role does construal level play in the affirmation process? That's exciting because to me, if you're showing these effects on long-term outcomes, then there's obviously cognitive, motivational, affective processes that are going on over time. And so to me, I'm sort of heartened by seeing the multiple mechanisms because I don't think that anything that is multifaceted or impactful as grade performance or stress levels is likely to be determined by just one psychological mediator or mechanism. So those are three sort of general things I think about when I think about affirmation more broadly. And then the terms of what I'm excited about in our own affirmation lab, it's integrating affirmations with other theoretical constructs, other intervention approaches, and seeing if affirmation can be embedded into other ongoing programs to help augment those programs. So with one former graduate student, Phil Arrett, we've looked at the intersection of self-affirmation and implementation intentions. Okay, you could think about an affirmation as more of a motivational manipulation. You think about implementation intentions as more of a procedural or cognitive manipulation. How can you integrate these different approaches? In this case, look at alcohol use among high college student drinkers. With another former PhD student, Kim Hartson, I've been very interested. She's led a study where they went to Lesotho in Africa, which has a very high HIV rate incidence, and they went to a positive living with AIDS counseling program, and they had half of them do an affirmation right before, and half of them just do the regular positive living with AIDS program. So the question there is, can you augment an existing program that's ongoing with an affirmation? And in terms of the intentions to change their health behaviors, she found some promising effects. So thinking about augmenting other effects is something that I think is really an exciting direction for affirmation research. So thanks again to the coordinators, and thanks for your time.
All right, thanks, David. So now I want to introduce Geoff Cohen, who is a professor in the School of Education and the Department of Psychology, and I think the School of Business at Stanford University. Is that it?
Yeah, I think so.
Geoff is an unbelievably prolific researcher and an excellently inspiring speaker, so we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks. So I was just going to, I really enjoyed the talks, and I love this, the kind of, just kind of brainstorming together, so I think we could have a pretty fruitful discussion. I was just going to, in reaction to the talk, make, I think, 2 points and raise 3 questions, briefly. The first point is, this question of like, where does the causal power in what we do reside? And I think that there may be a risk in getting caught up in the literal, material intervention. The power, I think, is in the psychological process that's activated by the intervention. So there is a process, a self-affirmation process that Claude elaborated on in '88 and others followed up on. It's a powerful process that people want to affirm the self. When it comes under threat, people try to reaffirm it. And it's a basic underlying process that's powerful. It's so powerful that when you get this tiny little input into it, sometimes, like, a little reminder of what gives me meaning, what I care about, people run with it. They say, I value this, and that means I'm a good person, and being a good person means I can cope with this situation. So I think that's really, really important to sort of stay focused on the underlying theory. The intervention, so to speak, the intervention, I don't know, might work in another 100 years, might not. Maybe what's an affirmation is going to sort of change how you induce it. But what I put my chips on is the underlying process, the self-affirmation process, and the way in which that process interfaces with experience. So that's one point, the power of the process. Kurt Lewin would say, in his work on trying to create social change, he'd say, it's really important to aim not at an outcome, whether it be like worker productivity or school achievement. What you want to aim at is the process that produces the outcome. Not GDP, but the processes that produce GDP. Because the process is what creates and recreates the outcome. So I think that this emphasis on the invisible process, that's like what we have to kind of keep our eyes on, even though it's very hard because it's like an invisible thing, versus the intervention is this tangible thing you can sink your teeth into. Okay, so process. So the power of the process, causal power resides in the process, not in the literal intervention. The second point is, I think one big theme of the research to date is that affirmation interventions can be powerful, but their effects are conditional. So powerful but conditional. And I think that's the way I put a lot of things in social life, like a comment, a word of praise, a disclosure. Like these things in the right time, in the right place can change a life, change a person's course through a career, but it all hinges on the conditionalities, kind of saying that thing in the right place and in the right time. Saying, I don't know, it's like saying, I love you. That can be a powerful intervention, but it depends critically on saying it to the right person at the right time in the right place. So let's know. Becca Farrar and I wrote a little paper that kind of tried to integrate some of these conditionalities. We called it a sort of 3T approach, but the basic idea is that when there's a confluence of targeting, tailoring, and timeliness, you get powerful effects. So the right person gets the right intervention at the right time. So I'm a student stressed out at school. I get the right intervention and affirmation at the right time, right before I take that first threatening test. And we found, at least in the health, or she found, at least in the affirmation and health research, that it was the combination of these three things, more or less, but especially sort of the timeliness of the threat and the timeliness of the intervention, that these two or three things, depending on how you coded it, predicted larger effect sizes, affirmation effect sizes in the affirmation and health research. In fact, there was some evidence of a synergistic effect that when you combine when the affirmation was timely with respect to the threat and also timely with respect to the availability of resources in the right place, at the right time, you get the sort of synergistic effects, such that the effects are even larger. So finding that right spot is really key. And I think, again, there's a risk of getting caught up in the foreground of sort of the intervention itself and ignoring what's in the background, all the conditionalities. There's that sort of Taoist example, like you get up, you say, when the person says, I drove to work today. They're saying, I drove to work. I was the causal agent. But no, you actually weren't. You could only drive to work because you had a car that worked. There was a sort of road system that was available. The roads were plowed if there was snow. There was a traffic system for navigating to get to work. You had all this help. And by you were the sort of last key step in a long chain of events. I think that when interventions have big effects, that they're often like that. They're a sort of catalyst or that last step it's the sort of last step in a chain of events that has already begun. And so I think these sort of key conditionalities speak to the conditionalities of affirmation are kind of like that. It's not that affirmations have invariant effects. Their effects depend on things that are in the environment already, being given at the right time, the right place, where there are resources available. Okay, so those are the 2 points. The process is powerful, not the intervention itself. And the process is powerful, but conditional. And then just some quick questions just to put on the table after listening to some of the talks. One question is, what is the motive? What is the self-integrity motive? I think Jenny brought up this question in a really interesting talk. Is it to esteem the self? Or is it to be an esteem-worthy person? There's something stuck with me, and Adam Smith had it in his theory of moral sentiments, has this line where he says, people, when they're well-functioning, they don't seek praise. They seek to be praiseworthy. I think that's kind of an important distinction. To be a good person, to have integrity, doesn't mean you're chasing self-esteem per se. It's not that you want to esteem the self. It's that you want to do those things that manifest your integrity, that are worthy of esteem. So what is the motive seems to be one question. Another question is, what is the process, the mechanism through which affirmation has both short-term and long-term effects? And a lot of the talks address this question, but one of the things that came up in a couple of the talks is the sort of role of time. What is the mechanism through which affirmation propagates itself through time when it does? That's a really interesting question. Another question beyond what is the motive, what is the process, is what, as Bill was getting at, is an affirmation? What do we mean by it? Does it need to involve writing or not? I think of an affirmation in a more general way as a kind of situational opening that permits a person to manifest their integrity. It's almost like a sort of channel, so that what is inside of me that has integrity can kind of come out and surface. And with a lot of the interventions that we do with values intervention, that channel takes the form of a question, like, what are your values? Tell me about them. But I suspect that it could take many other kinds of forms. I'm thinking of Elizabeth Cohen's research on cooperative learning classrooms, where she gives disadvantaged minority kids as kind of an opportunity to enact competence by being leaders on something that they're an expert in the classroom, thereby sort of reversing the normal hierarchy of the classroom. Maybe that's kind of like an affirmation. She's creating a situation in which the kids can kind of manifest their integrity, manifest what they're good at, and do so by showing a competence that would otherwise be hidden from view. Okay, so what is the motive? What is the process? What is an affirmation? Last question, I guess I have 4 questions, is what are the moderators of affirmation, as Bill was getting at, but also how can we weave the affirmation process into our institutions, into our medical care, into our schools in a more systemic way? I don't think any of us originally thought that the self-affirmation itself, this like little piece of paper, was the thing that we would want to disseminate. I think it's the idea, the process. And when you start to think, wow, we've had this pretty consistent big effect with a tiny intervention, it starts to captivate the imagination. Well, what if these kids had embedded in their experience in the classroom and in their interactions with their teachers opportunities to feel affirmed, to feel respected? And we'd always thought, well, why in the world does it take us, these goofy researchers, to come along to produce these results? Why are these kids getting affirmation already, getting the validation that they could or should or deserve to receive in the school as it exists in the status quo to begin with? And I think the wisdom that we have to share really speaks to this point, that if we can, the big fish to fry here is opening teachers' eyes, practitioners' eyes to the power of the self-affirmation process and their agency in initiating it and perpetuating it in the people that they care for. So that's all I'm going to say.
So I don't know whether you guys want to actually just kind of respond to some of those questions that Geoff posed, or whether it's better to have some specific guiding question that I have for my list, but happy to do whatever you guys feel. They're all kind of related, so. Okay, so I think with the rise of attention in the media with all these big intervention studies, I'm curious what you guys think about how to sort of discuss self-affirmation so that journalists are sharing this idea and this topic with audiences in appropriate ways. What are some things that you guys have done in the past, and what things do you think work best for that?
I gave my sense of that before. I think that we want to emphasize the context, with which these students are, or whoever the participants are in your studies, that you're describing things from their perspective, that you're also talking about all the resources that need to be in place for the manipulations to have an effect. If the school system wasn't functioning, you wouldn't have the ability for an affirmation or any type of intervention to have that effect that it might. So to establish what is going on in the context that could be perpetuating these effects over the long term. So focus less inward on this manipulation and more in terms of what is the context that could be perpetuating these effects.
I think another issue that I've grappled with, and probably others here have as well, is trying to separate self-affirmation from these other things that the media and the public have heard about, self-esteem being one of them. As I mentioned before, there's some evidence that whole big self-esteem movement in the 1980s potentially was detrimental to academic performance. And if people start talking about self-affirmation as self-esteem, we could very quickly get in trouble. So I haven't done this much educational work as you guys have, but I think when talking to reporters about the educational work, it's really critical to make that distinction. This is about values. And in fact, there's some evidence that affirming people based on personal accomplishments is also not the way to go. You have to affirm their values. If you affirm their accomplishments, it's more about contingency, right? It's not about what's core to them. And when I've talked to journalists and others about that, it's very difficult to explain in a way that they really get that difference, which we think is key, but they think it all sounds like the same gobbledygook, right?
Maybe it needs another title, maybe we should call it something else. What do you think?
Well, the other thing is,
Yeah.
you know,
It's
years ago, we had the
always been
Stuart Smalley
a word.
problem too.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
past that now.
It's always been a word.
Yeah.
Or-
What can we call it?
I failed to think of an alternative then and do now. I don't know. And dealing with the press is so daunting.
Yeah, it's like a
Because they do want to
self-broadening.
reduce it to manipulation.
Yeah.
They want to see that you've got, that manipulation is the thing to focus on, that it's a silver bullet, that it will
Yeah.
work everywhere, that it's unconditional. And they hold you to that conception of it. And so the first instance of a conditional effect
Yeah,
is interpreted as an invalidating effect.
yeah,
And so you're kind of constantly under the pressure of, in talking to them, trying to bolster them against that. But I don't know, I don't have any remedy to that. I hate to get calls from the press about any of the research I've been associated with, because it's, you talk to them and talk to them and talk to them, and they say the same thing they said when the conversation began.
Mm.
You read the
Mm.
so you want to do as much as you can to get, the only approach I've seen is to write for the public,
yeah,
ourselves, and which often the public or the outlets are more welcoming to that than we think, and there are more ways of doing it now than there used to be. But you can't, you have to put things into public space to which the media have to hold themselves accountable.
yeah,
They're accountable to what's in the public domain, not what's in the scientific literature. They don't know about it, they don't have the time to expose themselves to it, to think about it. They just pay attention to what's already in the press.
Mm.
And so I do think that's a strategy, is to spend a little more time getting, for example, all of your comments, focusing more on the underlying process and not the operationalization in a cooked up to deal with laboratory
Mhm.
circumstances. To hold the whole framework accountable to that is what they do. They will do implicitly, and so you wind up defending this thing that it could have gone a completely different way,
yeah,
and can go a completely different way. And they're missing the importance of the underlying process and the role that plays in students, in the case of educational applications to student outcomes. So the only thing I can think of is to not rely on a reporter in a hurry typing as they talk to you to convey these
Mm.
things.
One thing, just to add to that, I think, maybe this is a very little minor point, but I think in the literature, we are being a little more careful now in our
Mm.
terminology, and I think you guys get credit for this. I'm now seeing more papers with values affirmation or value affirmation in the title, rather than self-affirmation. And right now, maybe that's not viewed as a big difference, but I think it is, because maybe we are bringing values online without necessarily bringing on the entire self-concept, and the ecosystem, you know, to use Jenny's terms. I'm not sure how you feel about that, Claude, because that moves away from the terminology of the theory, but that seems to be more precise and maybe more appealing to those who are writing about it.
I have no ego attachment.
Well, you sent around that interesting article about that research showing that you could exert some control over the press release, right?
Yeah.
Maybe like, for example, the university press release. That was really interesting.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
there was a Vox article a month or so ago. And some researchers have been working with the university press release to try to improve the quality of their reporting of their own academics' research, and then seeing if it's better when it goes out in terms of the press release. Is it better when other media, pick it up? So doing it ourselves, I totally agree. When we had,
It's a good thing too.
when David Nussbaum is a collaborator, and he's been excellent at working with us in SPSP to try to get out our work into broader forums via op-eds and other ways of getting our work out. He's done workshops at SPSP about that. That's just an example of kind of taking it more under our own control to characterize the work in the careful way that we want, so that when people go to look for it in a forum that's more accessible, they could see the way we want our work represented.
May I could pose a question, I'm just curious,
Yeah.
and to the audience too, like, given the state of the knowledge, given what we know about self-affirmation, which has been going on for decades now, what's the best way to use the knowledge that we've gotten to support people, to change the world for the better? What do we do next? And so, Bill, you were saying, like, scaling up, testing it, like putting it in the water, testing whether we should put it in the water, or I'm just wondering, like, as a question, like, where do we go? It's that kind of question that you have to ask as a social scientist. Like, what do you do with the knowledge? Where do we go from here? What's the best way to have, a positive impact that's judicious?
And of course, the water idea is fairly grandiose, but you can imagine having self-affirming statements or opportunities imbued into messaging, imbued into education, imbued into relationships, patient-provider communication, in ways that are just natural. They just
they're
become
natural.
part of it. So, but I don't know how to do that.
I mean, good. So, we have a number of people in talks that are from the health and medical side of things, and you could imagine the discussion of the studies that have been done, as well as the overall theory, being a part of medical school curriculum. So, doctors who have good bedside manner often ask you about other aspects of your life before they go on to administer a treatment or diagnose a problem. You could see that as being consistent with the idea that it could reduce a defensive response, it could make people less stressed, and so to the extent that's incorporated into the curriculum, and some people have an idea that this is not just something that that this is something that can make the experience better for your patients and also help you with the medical outcomes. You want them to be adherent to the medication. You want them to listen to what you're saying and not be defensive and resistant. That might be a way to incorporate it into pedagogy.
But you could build healthcare for it too. Because like you get the way that the healthcare system works too is like, I don't know if that's incentivized. Like, let's take some time and talk about your, what you care about, versus like, let's kind of rush you in, rush you out, so I can get on to the next patient. I mean, I wonder if our kind of incentive systems kind of deter this kind of personal touch.
I'm going to open it up in case anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask or get discussion on. Yeah, Jen.
My question is about interpreting null effects and interventions, and particularly Geoff's comments about it's about the psychological process. And so one thing I'm wondering is, how do we tell when we do an intervention and it doesn't work? Is it because it didn't work in that domain or that context or with those people, or for that outcome, or did it not actually start that psychological process? Was it something about the actual intervention that didn't affirm? It was too short, it wasn't engaging enough. And so my question is also kind of about manipulation checks, and if there is sort of a best practice in the field, because I think they're often not included. But how do you know if your study affirmed participants or not, and if it set off that process to begin with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I take your question.
I wonder if we could pass on that question to Peter, actually.
Yeah, that'd be great, Peter.
I think Peter has done a really nice job of developing manipulation checks and ways of trying to capture whether people have been affirmed or not. And I know that he has said that manipulation checks themselves can be affirming, which means including them could potentially undermine your study. But do you have thoughts about that, Peter?
just said what I would have said.
We've been working together for a while.
Yeah, I mean, we have a sort of, we use a retrospective, it was suggested by a reviewer, actually might be somebody in this room. The best we've got is a retrospective affirmation check, which removes the problem of it acting as a kind of mediating process and messing up your manipulation. But it does raise problems in and of itself, obviously, because it's a retrospective thing,
Yeah.
so it's a constant problem.
I think
actually, one of the things that some people have done is actually use Jenny Crocker's items, because they're quick, hit them, two of them sometimes, you stick them in the middle. And we've got lots and lots of studies where the self-affirmation manipulation has boosted ratings on loving and connectedness. Very rarely, if ever, I think I can think of one study where it mediated any of the effects on the outcomes. That's another study. But it's pretty robust in terms of being positively associated with them.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think looking at the content of what people write can be revealing, doing linguistic analysis.
Yeah, if you actually get them to write, then there's lots of
Yeah,
things.
for example. I mean, for what it's worth, we always do a lot of pilot testing before we go, just like at a really small level, even just working with 10 kids at a school, giving them the materials to do, to make sure it's, then we interview them afterwards to kind of make sure it's having the kind of experience, it's creating the kind of experience we're hoping for. I don't think we've ever done focus groups, but I know people have done focus groups to kind of evaluate materials, and that can be really helpful. And it's not like you need a lot of people. You get a sense pretty quickly after 5 or 6 kids whether the thing is kind of producing the desired psychological state as they kind of articulate it. I think, for example, one time we did this, I remember vividly, was with 6th graders this was with David, 6th graders in a rural, rustic area, many of whom were from immigrant families and didn't speak English very well. And we realized that this term values was something that anyone understand. It was a little alienating. So we changed the word values to things, like pick a few things that are important to you. And that made it much, much better. It seems like a tiny little change, but we wouldn't have discovered that before going in. We wouldn't have discovered that unless we had taken the time to pilot test. So I think one answer to your question isn't just through manipulation checks, but through doing the work of piloting and interviewing participants to make sure, to kind of get a feel for whether or not it's creating the experience that you want. And then, if you don't get effects, it's a bit more interpretable. You gain a lot more leverage.
The thing I would add is,
point out that the presentation that Ian made about diagnosing the
That's right.
situation was really together. You start to get a sense of whether you're bringing something to the right place.
Yeah.
Is it the right thing?
Right.
It may not be the right thing at all. I mean, there's so many reasons why there could be something like an achievement gap. And you're in an entirely, single-sex high school. Those kind of threats may have very little to do with it. It could be resource differences. It could be teaching skill. I mean, it could be a whole bunch of things. So, I think that's very helpful.
Having good diagnostics of the presence of threat
Yeah.
is really useful.
that was, that was very similar to what my train of thought was as well, was to identify the threat response that you're trying to reduce. So to basically run the control condition first. What is the defensive response or the stress, the stressful response that you're anticipating? Whom do you think will show that effect the most? And if you have a good, who do you think will be most defensive? The very first affirmation study that I did built on work that Ziva Kunda and Shelley Chaikin had done, where they had already identified a very clear defensive response that caffeine, drinking, women were more resistant to information linking caffeine use or coffee drinking with negative health outcomes than either men in one study or women who did not drink caffeine. So you had a big defensive response, or we thought it was a defensive response, but it could have been due to other factors. Then if you show that, then you have a threat response with which potentially an affirmation or some other intervention or manipulation could speak to. So kind of understanding your control condition first, I think, which is kind of part of the pilot testing process.
And that's something we haven't really talked about too much today, is how you actually design and choose a control condition. This is a problem in all research, because the control condition can undermine your ability to get a main effect. And we have this standard control condition where someone writes about a value that's important to someone else, that's low on their own list. But I always, and I don't know how you guys feel about this, I've always felt a little squeamish about that one, because it seems like it's manipulating three different things. You know, you're changing the value they're talking about another person, and talking about how it's important to that other person. And so how do you, almost want to deconstruct that too and see which is the essential piece of that. And is that really the most appropriate control group? I've used it many times, so I'm as guilty as anyone, but it almost feels like there should be something a little better than that.
But it isn't the only control that gets used.
Yeah, of course.
There are, it's got that kind of control matching that's got some poetry about it, but there are kind of less matching.
Yeah. David, I just want to, I wanted to springboard off something you said. I think that has been helpful. There's a student in my lab, his name is Michael Schwabe, and he did a replication of affirmation with further education, like community colleges in England. And he did something interesting, which was to first analyze the control condition so that he could see where underperformance was. So he kept himself blinded to the treatment and analyzed the control condition, but also did a literature review on where in this context, which groups in this context underperform. And he identified a couple of groups, for example, Black Caribbeans, that were especially underperforming in terms of exam performance and attendance. And there was one other I can't remember, but just based on analyzing the control condition, he found these sort of underperforming, these groups that were not doing as well as other groups, and as well as they should have done given their prior records. There was like a kind of residual gap. And so based on that, he pre-registered that we predicted a main effective affirmation for the students as a whole. These are kind of generally stereotyped group. But a stronger effective affirmation for Black Caribbeans in these subgroups that he had identified. And that's what he found. And so it was like a nice, just like an interesting way to balance competing priorities. Like you want to be able to, be open and kind of discover where the threat resides. But at the same time, you also want to do hypothesis testing. And so I just thought that was a nice integration. Of course, there's always then, someone kvetches well, there could be regression to the mean in the control condition, but anyway, it's a nice, it's just an interesting way to kind of start to begin to identify, where the threat may lie, if anywhere, and is to look at the control condition.
I think there's another problem with null findings, maybe particularly in the health domain, and that is when you're measuring the outcomes. And we tend, I think, to measure the outcomes quite rapidly. And of course, given all the stuff that you've been doing on the processes that are set in train, it's entirely possible that it's a subset of null findings that are actually being measured prematurely. We haven't got the outcomes.
That's true. Yeah, how long do you wait?
How long do you
Yeah, like
Kevin, do you want to? Sure.
Yeah, so we ran a study in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. They did multiple affirmations each year. So 4 and 6, 4 and 7th, and 1 more in 8th. And for all of 6th grade, the results were flat. So there were no effects on grades, no effects on discipline, no effects on attendance. Fast forward 1 more year, and we start seeing hints on all 3 of those outcomes, some marginal, some significant. And then by 8th grade, they're all significant. So if we had stopped the study at the end of 6th grade, we would have concluded this was a null study. But we kept going because we kind of committed beforehand to do it over this 3-year period, and the effects emerged over time. So what's changing? Well, the environment's potentially changing. It's somewhat speculative, but we've sort of zeroed on this explanation that maybe the 7th grade year was sort of this critical, threatening year for students. And this is, again, speculative, but imagining coming into 6th grade, there might have been a lot of supports in place for students, new 6th graders. We're taking care of you, you're a new student, you're the small fish on the big campus now. Maybe some of that goes away by 7th grade. I think the broader message is the context changes, even as the students are changing as well, even though while the intervention was kept constant. And so, yeah.
And did you continue to affirm during that time?
Yeah, so they did 4 in 6th grade and 4 in 7th grade, and then 1 like halfway through 8th grade. So, and that was there was a booster manipulation in 8th grade. So it was actually primarily in 6th and 7th grade, and then the largest effects emerged 1 year later in 8th grade, and they were large effects on discipline. Work actually showed the largest effect, number of discipline incidents that students received in 8th grade, and yeah. That was actually mediated by school trust in 7th grade. So affirmation increased school trust in 7th grade, and then that mediated the effect on discipline in 8th grade. Yeah, the paper just came out, so contact me if you'd like to hear more about this.
Does anyone have any other questions? Yeah, Peter.
So, picking up on something that Bill said, this particularly in relation to kind of health type stuff, I'm actually quite apprehensive. I think about the idea of taking health interventions up to scale, given that we know so little about the dangers of rebound effects in those who are unthreatened by the kind of health issue. And that's not what my question is about. I've been thinking, so I'm less kind of bothered about where you might use it in kind of small group settings or one-to-one settings where you're kind of working with, say some patients who are non-adherent, you want to encourage them to be more adherent. I think self-affirmation intervention might help. But what do you tell them about why you're asking them to do it? I mean, there've been some studies about that in the education that we've heard today. But if you and I know we mustn't fetishize the actual intervention, but we know that the kind of value affirmation is the gold standard, it works, we're confident. We want to transplant that into something that's a more applied setting. So you give somebody, say, right, I want you essentially to take your medication to time and to dose. But first I want you to write this piece about your values and why you're important, in this kind of medical environment where time is pressing. How do you do that? What do you say to them?
Well, we have some people in this room who are doing that, so.
I mean, in our study, how we're consenting people is that they know they're in the study because they have high blood pressure. We're not telling them that we're most interested in changing their adherence to their medications. And we're selecting people who have uncontrolled blood pressure, so they have that infers that they have had.
But I don't think the problem arises in research studies, because I think people take stuff on trust and they realise you kind of ask them to do a slightly odd thing, and that's part of the values they bring to that setting. The problems arise when you want it to be in the real world. You haven't got a control group anymore. Yeah. You're confident in the effects. You want to get people to do something, and this is you're confident this is a way.
I just think it's so interesting that we think it's odd. To me, I mean, I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking aloud. It's like, why is it odd? Like we had this discussion when we were trying to do a values affirmation and map. And the teachers found it odd. It's just incongruous. Like, that's kind of interesting that these things in our culture don't go together. Like, yet I have that expectation my teacher or my doctor might inquire about what I value. And maybe that's part of what we're doing is kind of opening up these spaces that are kind of overly bureaucratized, maybe, dehumanized, right? So that, they're now, maybe someday it would not be so odd to ask people about their values in these kinds of settings. It wouldn't feel strange to be inquiring because we'd understand that this is just kind of what's appropriate, what's kind of what makes for a better experience in the healthcare center or the classroom. Go ahead.
I'm just mindful of the fact that a good amount of the research in the literature on self-affirmation, some significant percentage is done in Western countries, right?
Yeah.
And if we were to do the same kinds of studies in countries where bringing values online is just part of the ecosystem, right, of that culture, maybe it wouldn't be so odd.
Yeah,
No, I was going to respond to that. So how do scaling this up or disseminating this more broadly, we sort of thought that the writing exercise is great. It seems to be able to do it in a medical encounter, but moving it downstream so that it's actually the physician is coached that their first task is to do 1 minute on eliciting the patient's values. That's part of the interview. It may be the way to go. Obviously, we have to test and see if that produces affirmation or not. But that should be well tolerated. We ask patients a whole lot more.
It's part of being a good doctor.
Questions than that. We're asking them about their sex lives and their bowel habits, and values is not going to be a problem.
Now that you remind me, actually, there was a study recently, wasn't there, in Britain, I think, where they just got the doctors at the very end to ask a question about the weight of the patient, where they had overweight patients. And there was a way in which it was phrased. It was one sentence thing right at the end. Didn't mention obesity, and there were measurable improvements in the weights of the patient 6 months down the line. So very subtle.
The way doctors communicate with patients is so poor, so dysfunctional, that these little changes are likely to make a big difference.
Yeah, one thing maybe to say, because the word scale up does terrify me. And
It's 2 words.
But because, there is the analogy to drugs, ibuprofen. It's conditional too. You can't use it effectively everywhere. It produces a lot of null effects. It sometimes backfires. You can get addicted to it. But when a reporter's talking to you on the other end of the line, when they ask you about scaling up, they think this thing's supposed to work all the time, and it's supposed to revolutionize whatever domain you're in, healthcare or education. That's what they're thinking about. They don't see this analogy. But I think that the truth is closer to the analogy, that an affirmation is going to, as we've all been pointing to, is conditional. And over years, the conditions will get clearer because research gets done. There's enough there to warrant to move research forward, but it's going to be over like for any drug. It's just going to take some time to know, well, use it here, but don't use it there. Use it, those boundary conditions, those things will come to light as the science moves forward. But the worry you have is that the media is not going to be patient with that, and they're going to take any kind of null effect. And for them, the sensational story is that this is bullshit. That's the sensational story they want to tell. And I don't know how to reconcile these two worlds other than to give them some metaphors like that. That if you just looked at the first instance that aspirin didn't work, so many other wonder drugs didn't work, you'd give up on it. But this is a process, a scientific process by which, over time, the boundary conditions, the conditions under which it works, get to be clear, and it gets to be a very valuable thing. At that point, it may revolutionize things to some degree, but until that, we really can't endorse your expectation for it.
And it's not just about the press, it's also about our own academic community, right? If we do incremental studies, they don't get published in top journals, and so for junior scholars, for example, as an example, Kevin, I think that intervention sounds wonderful. I would love to know whether giving them 5 affirmations would have been different than giving them 4. That seems really critical, right? So that it can be passed off to anybody who wants to use an intervention. But no one's going to do that study. You're probably not going to do that study because that's so incremental and not very interesting conceptually. So that worries me a little bit that it's going to take us a long time to build that toolkit in a way that will satisfy promotion and tenure incentives, but also get to where the science needs to be.
Unless we all run one study, the same study must be varying it very slightly across all the different labs.
Not a bad idea.
Yeah,
Someone does 4, someone does 3, 2.
yeah, it's a great idea.
I also have a related question about the issue of scaling up and talking to the media. So I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about the paper saying that self-awareness of self-affirmation makes the effect disappear. So I'm wondering, like, when you talk to the media, if you talk that, okay, if you write about your personal beliefs and personal values, it's good for your health, good for a lot of good different things. And when people engage in self-affirmation themselves while thinking about this report, will that effect disappear? Or, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the irony is that with the intervention, the irony is like if people found out, I suspect that, you know, oh, you're just getting this affirmation because it's part of a research study, you were randomly assigned a condition, blah, 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 it would kind of lose its impact. I remember I used to do this research on positive mood with Alice Eisen, and she had this wonderful little manipulation where she would give people little bags of candy that made them happy, and she'd get these wide-ranging effects on creativity, decision-making, just made people all have more altruism. And so, being an RA in her lab, I decided to use that manipulation on one of my friends, and I gave it to them, and I said it made them happy, and then I said, oh, this is a positive mood induction, and you could just see the positive affect drain from his face.
Would that be like affect likelihood?
What?
Like, even though you're doing it, wouldn't that be like?
Well, I think part of it's like the social. What's that? Yeah, because I think it's a social meaning. It's like, I'm giving you this. This is. I appreciate you. This is, you know, and it relates to what Eric was talking about. The affirmation, I'm interested in you. These researchers are interested in you, that your teacher cares about. It's the social meaning of the intervention that's impactful. And so when, you know, you take that away, all you have left is a feeling of being manipulated. And I think that's a really tricky space when you start talking about how to disseminate. That's why I kind of think that it's not like we're trying to disseminate an intervention, a bag of candy, some paper. We're trying to disseminate a kind of almost like a philosophy, a way of engaging with people that respects and affirms them. And there's ways to do that. There's skill sets you can develop to do that. But it's almost like it's a kind of psychological spirit that we're trying to disseminate, not a specific intervention. Those carry that risk. At least that's one perspective.
Yeah, I've seen data. My wife had data on what teachers produce big achievement gaps and what teachers produce small achievement gaps. And a lot of teachers intuitively know how to affirm kids and when they need it, and they know that. And you know, it's like all that Cialdini research, where you start with the practitioner, the person that really knows how to sell cars, and then you see what they do, and you kind of abstract that into it. And I think some of that work would help us. That I think there are teachers, probably we've all had them, that just they know that kid. I saw a videotape you showed me once, Geoff, of a teacher interacting in a classroom, and there's a kid who knows the answer and kind of knows about this, but is too shy to say it and is really embarrassed, and she's an African-American girl in this classroom, and the teacher just like knew exactly what to do, and she, you know, brought the kid up and put her arm around her and then told her to say these things, and then she said them, and I mean, so now that's just real affirming skill.
Yeah.
And it's woven into that teacher's, tool set. So it exists out there.
Mm.
It exists out there. And that might be helpful in us thinking about how to get it more, in the water.
Have
That's
you
part of common sense too.
Yeah.
have you ever thought about behavioral activation therapy in the context of values affirmation? So behavioral activation therapy is like part of CBT for depression, and one of the main components of it is having people identify their values and their goals and find ways to live life consistent with those values and those goals. And I'm curious if you've ever thought about how to reconcile that with sort of self-affirmation.
It might be affirming, to identify behaviors that affirm the self, and so that might be part of what makes behavioral activation therapy so effective. Start thinking about other domains where affirmation ideas could apply and be used to make more impactful what's already being done.
Motivational interviewing.
Motivational.
Yeah, I was just going to say motivational interviewing too. So we had a review paper where we looked at the conceptual overlap between affirmation theory and motivational interviewing, where you have people identify what's important to them, and then how the health behavior you're trying to change is getting in the way of that thing that is most important to them. And my intuition is that good practitioners are incorporating these, lessons intuitively, but making it a little bit more explicit that this is something that you can incorporate. Here are some ways that you could do it. Could, as I said before, maybe augment the effectiveness of a motivational interview.
The biggest thing the teachers did, I forgot to say this, the biggest thing the teachers who had small achievement gaps did, that the teachers who had big achievement gaps did not do, was they invited students to talk about their background and their personal experiences in class.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, when we, Tanner Wallace and I did a little study where we were looking at teachers who, kind of similar to what you're saying, kind of close the achievement gap more. And when you look at the kind of low-performing versus high-performing teachers, like the low-performing teachers, they seem to be doing a fine enough job. They're kind of getting the information across. Then when you look at the high-performing teachers, they're like that example you gave, Claude, where you start to realize, wait a minute, there's all these missed opportunities just passing by these other teachers, like opportunities to connect, to ask them about their background, to even just simply say their name when calling on them. So I think there's probably, I kind of take it as like one lesson, it's just all the missed opportunities for connection and affirmation that probably just happen all the time in these institutions.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I have had a ton of fun with this discussion, so thank you, all three of you, for joining us for this. We are now moving on to the posters. There's only a handful, 6 or 7, so definitely stop by everyone's poster, get a chance to chat with them, and then after that, we're moving on.
Yeah, we'll
to
leave
dinner,
here about
so-
we'll leave here about 6:30